Imagine this. A 12-year-old girl, right, standing in a castle tower. Her hands are gripping this cold stone, and below her, she's watching enemy armies just pour into her homeland. Her whole world is, quite literally, crumbling around her. She's just become a duchess, basically the last hope for this proud, independent nation. And already, powerful men are deciding her fate. I mean, what happens when a child is basically forced to become a pawn in this really brutal game of power? Okay, so let's unpack this. Today we're doing a deep dive into the extraordinary and frankly heartbreaking life of Anne of Brittany. You might know her as the child queen forced to marry her executioner, but her story is so much more than just that tragedy. It's really about survival, resilience, and finding some kind of agency in, well, the most impossible circumstances.
Yeah, what's really remarkable, I think, about Anne's journey is how she managed to navigate a world that fundamentally saw women, especially royal women, as property, assets to be traded, inherited, or just conquered, not really as people with their own wills or desires. We'll explore how she went from being essentially a victim of political conquest into this formidable negotiator, someone who didn't just, endure things, but actively shape the destiny of nations, even while she was wrestling with just profound personal loss. And it raises this really compelling question, doesn't it? How do we find strengths? How do we make choices when everything seems completely predetermined?
Right. And our journey today, it's guided by this incredible deep dive we found from quiet historians on YouTube. It's titled The Child Queen Forced to Marry Her Executioner. It's so rich with detail, and it gives us a great shortcut, really, to understanding the hidden truths, the overlooked bits of Anne's story. So to really get the weight of what Anne inherited, you first have to understand Brittany itself. It wasn't just another part of France back then. Try to picture a land where these ancient Celtic traditions were still vibrant, whispering through the oak groves, where the Breton language was just part of the landscape, like the coast. It was the last truly free Celtic nation. A really stubborn, independent duchy, always kind of a thorn in the side of this ambitious, expanding French kingdom next door. Brittany was clinging fiercely to its own identity while, the rest of Europe was being reshaped around it.
And that fiercely independent spirit is so vital because it really sets the stage for the political powder keg that exploded in 1488. When Anne's father, Duke Francis II, died, he didn't leave any male heirs, which was a huge problem back then. Instead, he left two daughters, and 12-year-old Anne was the elder. Now, in that era, women were, and this is explicit, considered property, something to be inherited, traded, or conquered. So Anne's inheritance, it was this double-edged sword, wasn't it? It was her birthright, sure, but it was also effectively a curse that put her right at the center of this brutal power struggle for control of Brittany.
Yeah, you can just imagine it. The second the news of Francis's death gets out, boom, the vultures start circling the courts of Europe. So who were the big players immediately looking to, well, snatch up this young duchess and her really valuable duchy?
Well, on one side, you had King Charles VIII of France. He was barely older than Anne herself, actually. And he saw this as the perfect, long-awaited chance to finally absorb Brittany into his growing French empire. Just annex it. On the other side, there was the Holy Roman Emperor, Maximilian I, a man who really saw Europe as this giant chessboard. And to him, Anne was a critical pawn in his ongoing strategic game against France. Her name was suddenly on marriage contracts all over the continent, all without her knowledge, certainly without her consent.
Wow. So she's just 13 years old, facing this immense pressure, and she makes her first kind of desperate move, this secret, incredibly audacious and politically really risky proxy marriage to Maximilian. And for anyone not familiar, a proxy marriage meant someone else stood in for the groom, right? So literally a stand-in held her, probably trembling hand, as she spoke vows to a man she'd never even laid eyes on, a total gamble.
It absolutely was. It was a political alliance, basically, just disguised as a marriage. The idea was it would act as a sort of paper shield against French aggression, make France back off.
Yeah.
But what Anne, in her profound inexperience, really underestimated, gravely underestimated, was the sheer ruthlessness of young King Charles VIII of France. He wasn't about to let such a valuable prize just slip through his fingers because of some marriage performed by proxy. Not a chance.
And he certainly didn't let it go. 1491, French armies just swept across Brittany. Like a plague, the source says, iron and fire. They moved with this terrifying precision, capturing fortress after fortress, just slowly tightening the noose around Anne's duchy. It's just chilling to picture it. A 15-year-old girl, Anne, on the battlements in Rennes, watching those French banners just multiply on the horizon, like a deadly rash spreading closer.
That image really captures the brutal reality. And Maximilian. Despite the proxy marriage, despite the vows, he failed to send any meaningful aid. In that world, promises made to teenage girls, well, they were worth less than the parchment they were written on, frankly. To powerful men, anyway. So Anne's choice became stark. Horrifyingly stark. Surrender and maybe save her people from starvation. Or watch them starve as the siege dragged on. She chose surrender. I mean, what a choice for a child to have to make.
Unimaginable. And Charles VIII's terms for that surrender were just savage. Not only did Anne have to renounce her marriage to Maximilian, the one she'd gambled on, but she would be forced to marry Charles himself, the conqueror demanding the conquered as his bride.
The wedding itself, December 6th, 1491, at the Cathedral of Langeais. It was apparently magnificent, a huge display of French wealth and power. But Anne, barely 16, stood there. Her eyes must have been hollow, knowing she was, in essence, signing the death warrant of Breton independence right there. And the marriage contract was particularly cruel. It actually stipulated that if Charles died before her, she would be required by contract to marry his successor, making her a hereditary asset of the French crown, passed along like furniture.
God, that's grim. And the accounts of their wedding night, they describe something truly disturbing. Royal brutality just dressed up as ceremony. Anne, totally unprepared for this kind of harsh reality, apparently wept. Not, the delicate tears of some romantic bride, but raw, desperate sobs. Like a prisoner. The consummation was reportedly brutal, and then horrifically blood-stained sheets were publicly displayed as proof, reducing her most intimate traumatic moment to a matter of state record. Chilling.
Yeah, and it's really at this moment, this point of utter subjugation, that Anne seems to have developed a crucial survival mechanism. She learned this kind of internal fortification, a way to almost separate her mind from her body, preserving some essential core of herself that remained untouchable, inviolate. This wasn't just resilience. It was strategic, a kind of detachment that would actually allow her to navigate the endless indignities and later the really complex negotiations with a clarity that wasn't just overwhelmed by emotion. She turned that personal trauma into political leverage, in a way. It became her psychological armor for the years ahead.
Right. And then her first pregnancy followed pretty quickly, a moment the French court obviously celebrated. Anne herself must have felt such a complex mix of emotions, maybe some hope, certainly fear, and that devastating knowledge that she was now just trapped. Forever. But tragically, that first child was born dead.
And this, just devastatingly, became the pattern of Anne's life. She would endure at least 14 documented pregnancies, and most of them ended in miscarriage, stillbirth, or the infant dying very young. The psychological toll of each loss must have been immense. And it wasn't just her personal grief, you see. Each failure to produce a living heir, particularly a son, was also seen as this profound political failure in a world that measured royal women mainly by their ability to produce sons for the dynasty.
And Charles VIII's reaction to these repeated losses, it was just shockingly callous. There's no recorded grief for the lost children, no apparent concern for Anne's physical or emotional well-being at all. It must have been in those crushing moments she realized with this stunning clarity, she wasn't seen as a wife who'd lost a child. She was seen as a failed breeding project that needed to be, recalibrated or fixed. The pressure must have been absolutely suffocating.
Yeah. And meanwhile, Charles himself was proving to be a pretty incompetent king, often distracted by these ambitious and often pretty disastrous military campaigns down in Italy. He frequently left Anne effectively ruling France during his long absences, which is a profound irony, isn't it? She's gaining all this significant political power and administrative experience precisely because of her husband's neglect and incompetence, right in the midst of her personal tragedies. It was the strange twist of fate that allowed her to hone the very skills she'd desperately need later on.
And then, 1498, fate intervenes again, dramatically. Charles VIII died unexpectedly. He was just 27. Apparently struck his head on a low doorway. Bizarre accident. So Anne was, in a way, free, but only for a moment, right?
Exactly. Because according to those cruel terms of her original marriage contract, she was immediately required to marry Charles's successor, Louis XII. The problem, though, was that Louis was already married to Joan of France, who happened to be Charles's sister. Awkward. The solution was typically medieval in its, cynical efficiency. Louis sought an annulment from the Pope, his grounds. He claimed Joan was physically deformed and unable to consummate their marriage, despite them having been married for 22 years at that point. It was brutal.
Wow. And Anne watched Joan's public humiliation unfold, reportedly with growing horror, seeing her own potential future just played out right there in Joan's present suffering. It must have been such a stark, brutal reminder that royal women, even queens, were often not really seen as people, but as problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed.
But here's the thing. Anne was no longer that terrified 16-year-old from her first marriage. Not at all. She was 22 now, hardened by years of loss, betrayal, and crucially political experience. Her negotiations with Louis XII in 1499 were apparently a true masterpiece of royal diplomacy. She'd learned the hard way that even queens who seemed trapped could wield power if they were clever enough, if they knew how to leverage their unique, difficult position.
And she really used that hard-won power, didn't she? She managed to extract these unprecedented concessions from Louis. She secured Brittany's autonomous privileges, keeping some independence for her homeland. She got a significant say in the succession. And most crucially, she got a promise. A promise that if Louis died before her, she would not be forced to marry his successor. She would finally be free to choose her own fate. That must have felt huge.
Absolutely huge. So this second wedding, it was a far, far different affair from her first. Anne entered it not as some conquered prize, but as a negotiating partner, someone who had secured terms that robustly protected her interests and Brittany's. And Louis XII, he proved to be a different kind of husband. Calculating, yes, definitely, but also patient and willing to accept Anne as a political partner. Their marriage developed into more of a working partnership, really, based on pragmatism, maybe not deep affection, but it was a vast improvement. And it afforded her a whole new kind of power and stability.
Right. And Anne then just threw herself into this new role with, well, fierce determination. She consciously set up this court culture that blended French sophistication with these deeply cherished Breton traditions, keeping her heritage alive. She created powerful patronage networks, extending her influence throughout the kingdom. And she began this delicate, crucial work of making sure Brittany kept its unique identity, even though it was now linked to France.
And that psychological armor we talked about, it continued to serve her really well. She managed expectations constantly, prepared herself for loss, even as she prayed for success with each pregnancy. It sounds heartbreaking, but it was a necessity, wasn't it? Born from so many personal tragedies. It was a way of perhaps not hoping too much for her own children, because she knew how unbearable the losses could be if hope was too high.
Then, in 1501, the birth of a daughter, Claude. Finally. A moment of, well, seemingly pure joy in Anne's life. A child who lived and thrived. But even this happiness was complicated, wasn't it, by that constant pressure. Claude was a daughter, not the son France so desperately needed for a direct male succession. So the endless cycle of hope and grief, it just continued through her later pregnancies.
But despite that ongoing struggle for a male heir, Anne was incredibly proactive during this time. She became this passionate patron of the arts, using it very cleverly to celebrate Breton culture and history, keeping it visible. She established schools and hospitals. She built these vital networks of female power and influence around her. And crucially, she very carefully managed Claude's education, preparing her daughter for the brutal realities of royal life, giving Claude the tools and understanding that Anne herself had been forced to forge through fire.
Then skip ahead to 1514. Louis XII, he's now in poor health, and he starts contemplating remarriage after Anne's eventual death, which threatened to completely undo her entire life's work, right? Everything she'd done to secure her daughter's future and Brittany's place.
Exactly. But Anne's response was swift and decisive. She wasn't having any of it. She immediately arranged Claude's betrothal to Francis of Angoulême. Now, he was the heir presumptive to the French throne, the next in line after Louis. This was a brilliant political move, absolutely brilliant. It secured both her daughter's future, making her the future Queen of France, and Brittany's continued connection to the French throne, if not through her own sons, then through Claude's children. It was masterful.
With the immense toll of her life, just years of relentless political maneuvering, those repeated pregnancies, the constant stress, it had taken its toll. Anne died on January 9th, 1514. She was just 36 years old. Her last words, reportedly, were a heartfelt prayer for Brittany, a final acknowledgement of the homeland she'd sacrificed so much, really, to protect in her own way.
The profound irony of Anne's life is just undeniable. She was treated like property, passed from one husband to the next under duress. Yet, through sheer force of will, strategic intelligence, and maybe that psychological armor, she managed to become one of the most powerful women in European history. She learned to work within the very system that oppressed her, didn't she? Finding agency, finding power, right in the midst of subjugation, and protecting what she could, while accepting what she couldn't change. She didn't just survive, she actively redefined the expectations for queens. She set precedents for protecting female succession rights, and showed how a monarch could blend national identity with royal duty, even when married to her conqueror.
Yeah, what makes Anne's story so resonant, I think, is exactly that transformation. Here's this child forced into these marriages, enduring just unimaginable personal losses. Yet she rises to become this queen who genuinely shaped the destiny of nations. She went from victim to strategic player, and in doing so, she forever changed the game, really, for royal women and certainly for the fate of Brittany.
Absolutely. Anne's legacy teaches us that history isn't just about, the grand battles and the famous kings. It's also about individuals finding those small rebellions, small acts of resistance or negotiation that, when you add them all up, amounted to something resembling freedom, or at least agency. Her daughter, Claude, would eventually marry by choice, a path personity. Anne herself had painstakingly forged through her careful planning and those fierce negotiations. So what does Anne's story tell us today? About finding our own spaces of agency, maybe. Even within systems that seem designed to deny us powers, what does it tell us about that quiet, determined persistence it takes to preserve what really matters most to us?
And maybe, what does this all mean for you listening right now? Anne's story is this powerful reminder, isn't it? That even when forces seem totally beyond our control, shaping our lives in ways we didn't choose, there are always small spaces where hope can maybe flourish, where love can exist, where the human spirit can find ways not just to endure, but maybe even to triumph in its own way. So, what seemingly impossible circumstances in your own life might, just might, offer an opportunity for that kind of quiet, defiant persistence, something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep finding those hidden truths.